Alright, hey YouTube. So a few weeks ago I played a tournament in Burnaby, British Columbia. Now this was a standard 5 round Swiss, and today I'll be going over probably the highest quality game that I played this tournament. It wasn't so great for me overall, but this was a nice result that I got in round 2 against Raymond Kaufman, one of BC's uh, top active players, as well as the son of Larry Kaufman, who is a very popular figure back in the day, and also a prolific chess author. So we'll get into it right away. To start, I was also playing with the black pieces, and I decided to play the Nimzo. Just my solid repertoire against d4, especially against higher rated. So I tend to go for this when allowed. So bishop b4. Now, interestingly, Raymond, in his database at least, he does not always allow. He does not usually allow the Nimzo. He normally plays knight f3 on move 3, I believe. But in this tournament, he seemed to be playing. He seemed to be playing into the Nimzo quite a bit. So I thought that was interesting to see. So here against me, he played the e3 Nimzo here, which is definitely one of the most solid options, as well as probably the main line these days. So I play my c5 Nimzo. So for those who aren't quite aware, I have a chessable course that's based on the c5 setups in the Nimzo Indian, and I'm playing my repertoire. Now, I don't have my entire course memorized fully front to back, but I do know the ideas by heart and the general ideas at least, and he ended up falling into my preparation. So c5, he plays knight to e2 on move 5, which is definitely the critical test of the c5 Nimzo against the e3 setup. Now here, in this position, you can also play knight f3, and you can also play bishop d3. So if you play bishop d3 first, then black would continue knight c6, and then knight e2. This leads to very solid positions, and it's definitely hard for black to find an advantage, although I did actually beat an FM earlier in 2022 from this exact opening because my opponent did not quite understand, how to deal with the IQP positions that followed. But anyway, there's also knight to f3 with the idea that after black plays knight to c6, then you play bishop d3. So with the knight f3 and bishop d3, and now this allows black to play for a dark square strategy, starting with bishop takes c3, and then you go d6, and you basically build this pawn mass on the dark squares with e5, and there's lots of strategic play involved, and both sides have a very interesting game ahead of them. So my opponent avoided all that, and he played the more theoretical knight to e2, which he knew. And here, typically, what black players do from this position is either they fiend kettle their bishop immediately, b6 bishop to b7. You can also play d5, similarly to the lines where white plays bishop d3 first. But the idea of knight e2 is simply that white is going to play a3, and you're kind of going to have to give up your bishop pair without ruining white's pawn structure. So this knight e2 move is definitely a strong theoretical idea. And it seems like the main line here is to takes, and then d5. These lead to very dry positions where, bishop will retreat probably to e7 or to d6, and both sides just have a game. However, in my repertoire, I give the interesting move d6, and I have quite a bit of experience with this online. Basically, the main idea is you're simply defending this pawn so that after a3, you do not have to take the knight here. Instead, you can retreat to a5, which is a very interesting idea because in this position, there are, I believe, two critical tries. So you can either go rook b1 or g3. And on g3, in my course, I gave the move d5. So now, and only now that white, committed to a3 and also g3, now you strike in the center with d5, and both sides kind of regain their pawns back, and you can reach an endgame, but I find that there's still quite a bit of imbalance in the position, and I do like these positions a lot for black. Although rook b1 I consider the most critical in my course. So speaking of my course, I actually had this open on a window right next to me here. And in this position, see a little preview of what this variation goes into. After c5, knight to e2 and move 5. Black plays d6, a3, bishop a5, and now white can also, instead of continuing with g3, he can also take on c5, which seems like a natural idea. You want to trade queens and get black's pieces sort of backwards, but it's actually completely fine for black, and you'll see exactly why. So after queen takes, you don't have to move your king. You can just simply take back with the same bishop, and from here, black is simply going to develop his bishop to b7 and get some nice development. And I really fail to see where white's advantage is. Like structurally, it's fairly symmetrical, and the piece placement for both sides might differ a little bit, but overall, both sides are very solid here, and it's hard to find an opening. So going back to this game, he went into this. And in my course, I didn't give much analysis beyond this point because I find that it's very straightforward. Just develop the bishop to b7 like this, and black should equalize quite comfortably. So there are 4 games in the database here, and only one of them is recent from 2021. But out of the 4 games, 3 people chose to play king takes d8, which is also a fine option that I mentioned in my course. But bishop takes d8 is what I give, and this is what I played. So from here, there's plenty of moves for white. It's not like this is a totally critical position already. And white has several different options. So you can either go g3, bishop g2. You can move your knight out to, let's say, f4 or g3. You can also probably go knight to b5, although this move is not quite as good for a special reason. Anyway, my opponent goes bishop d2. So already I'm sort of, out of my familiarity here. I don't really understand the point of this move, bishop d2. It seems to be quite overly committal, and I don't really see what the bishop is doing there on d2 that it wasn't previously doing on c1. So I continue developing knight c6. I don't spend too much time on these moves, whereas my opponent is definitely tanking a little bit because he's unfamiliar with this endgame and what he's trying to go for here. And then he plays this interesting move, knight to c1. So at first glance, it might seem like a reasonable idea because black might have been threatening a move like knight to a5, hitting this pawn, as well as threatening to invade on b3. So this is kind of prophylaxis and defending some weakened light squares around his king. But in reality, this move is just a little bit passive and now allows black to really just get his pieces out very comfortably, and the knight's going to be pretty passive on c1 for the foreseeable future. So I continue on with b6 as planned. He goes g3 in kind and plans to counter this bishop on this diagonal, but I just continue normally, and then I play rook to b8. I simply want to defend this bishop prophylactically so that I can move my knight. Now here I thought it was critical for him to play knight to b5. In this position, he might be threatening to take and then take on a7 at some point. Although this doesn't work yet because my bishop would be hitting his rook in that case. But there are some threats. There are some threats on knight to d6 and knight takes a7 at some point. But since this bishop is defended, I think that I'm tactically doing all right here. So I would probably continue with a move like king e7 with a6 next. I believe this is perfectly fine for black. All right. So then he plays this move f4, f2 to f4. So there are some points to this move, but it also has some obvious drawbacks. So the obvious drawbacks are that it weakens this pawn and it weakens some other squares on the king side here. But the obvious point is that black was probably threatening to invade on e5 like this and threaten this pawn and also threaten checks, right? So this e5 square was definitely annoying for him, so he decides to stop it. But I'm unfazed by this. I mean, it's just, I guess he's gaining a little bit of space, but I have ways of dealing with this. And it's not like he has a pawn majority or anything. I'm not really worried about him gaining space in the center like this. So I proceed with a very natural plan, just going h5, preventing him from maybe expanding in the future like this, just prophylactically. And also I had the lingering threat of h5 5 to h4 to open some lines on the king side if desired. It was h3, intending to always meet h4 with g4, but you'll see that this actually comes into play later on in the game. This lingering threat of pushing this pawn to gain more space. So I continue with knight c6 to a5. I want to trade off these bishops since with these light square bishops traded off, I now have more control over these light squares that my opponent has weakened. So we trade, and here I want to keep my knight here because I want to force white to defend this pawn passively. So I take back with the rook. It's definitely the better recapture. He goes b3, which is forced. He wants to protect this pawn, and now I simply continue with rook b7 to d7. So a nice little shift of my rook here to control this d-file. And now if you look at white's position, he's kind of just very passive here. This knight, especially on c1, is very passive, tied down to the defense of b3. His king is still in the center, although it does move up the board in the next couple of moves. But his rooks are just very passive, and it's unclear what he's doing with this pawn setup here. So definitely black is enjoying the better side of equality in this queenless middle game. So it goes king to e2. I continue with bishop to c7, a very natural improving move. The bishop was doing nothing on the back rank, so I improve it, and I put some scope on this diagonal, which will be alluded to in the coming moves. So continues with the space gaining move, e4, but this is the first mistake, I believe, of the game. So my opponent is trying to just run me over with his pawns, which is logical because if he pushes his pawn to e5, I will be forced to retreat my knight, and then he might get his knight in the center himself. But this move creates an obvious weakness, and it is this d4 square. So I immediately jump in, and he defends it with bishop to e3, very logical. But I just go there anyway, because if he takes it, then his knight will be forced to move, and then I will get access to this e4 pawn. So he cannot really take it, he has to move his king. But by moving his king, there are some other issues. And from here, I actually have a missed win, which is not very obvious at all, but in hindsight, it's actually quite logical, and I'm disappointed that I missed it. So the winning idea here, if you want to pause your videos, you can take a look here. But for everyone else, I will continue on. So the move that I missed, really strong move, is this move h4. Now, I saw this move during the game and I considered it, but I was kind of moving a little bit quickly. I did not fully associate this move with the other ideas and threats I have in the position. And this move just works out really well in tandem with my other pieces, specifically the knight on d4 and the bishop on c7. So by playing this h4 move, I compel this pawn move forward, and if white just ignores it or he takes, then obviously that's just terrible because he weakens more squares, he opens up my rook. He does not want to do that. So let's say that he pushes pawn to g4. Now this creates a weakness on this diagonal that I can use to exploit using my bishop that was deployed to c7 just a few moves ago. So I start off from this position with the move knight to c2. This forks the rook in the corner, which is completely hanging, as well as eyeing this bishop on e3. So from here, I can go knight to c2, and I believe that after the move rook to a2, now I can take, and this move g5 is very, very powerful because this opens up this diagonal, this dark square diagonal. Let's say he takes, I can go knight to h7, and positionally, white's just completely busted. He has no squares for his pieces. I could take back on the next move. This bishop is fantastic on this diagonal. But I believe an even more forcing option for me was the move g5 right away, the move prior. So on this move, white can maybe try the move e4 to e5. This sort of blocks in my bishop and also attacks my knight. But from here, I don't actually move my knight because taking the knight isn't really that big of a deal. This opens up my bishop even more, and I have a bigger threat available. I have this move knight to c2 now. And let's say after rook to a2, now from here, I can take, and now all this pawn tension just completely favors me because I can take, and let's say knight to h7. His king is also very open in this line. And yeah, all these lines associated with g5 are very, very strong. So right here, h4, g4, g5. And the main idea that I missed actually was in this more forcing variation. So after f takes g5, I actually have this move bishop to g3, which is the key idea that I missed. And this is what justifies this whole line. Is that if he takes the pawn, I can actually throw in this move first. And now the king has to lose contact with his bishop on e3. And now no matter where the king goes, let's say to g1, now knight c2 is just a straight fork. And even though I don't technically win material here, after knight takes e3, g takes f6. This is just great for me. I have all these active pieces. These pieces are just really bad, especially this rook on a1. And positionally, I'm just completely winning here. I can play any number of moves. I can play bishop to e5 to collect a pawn here. I can go rook h6 to collect a pawn this way. There's so many ways to win from here. And yeah, this g5 move associated with in tandem with h4 and knight c2 is an idea that I wasn't able to find during the game. Anyway, in the game itself, I played this move knight to c2 immediately because I figured that the position after rook to a2 and knight takes e3 was still very healthy for me, and I was completely fine trading off these pieces. And I knew that I still had a slight advantage here, so I ended up going for this without much thought. And I go king to e7. But now white is sort of out of the woods and he can get his pieces traded. So it definitely was not the best course of action. But it's still definitely very safe for black. He goes e5. It seems like white's making a little bit of progress, but there's really just no follow-up after the move knight to g8, which is a very nice move because I plan to go knight to h6 and install my knight on f5 using this h5 pawn as a way to, discourage g4, which would prevent my knight from getting active there. So he goes rook to g2, trading off a set of rooks. I oblige, and then I go knight to f6, knight to h6 rather. So if he tries preventing it with g4, this seems like it might work because if I take, I'm pinned. But I always have this move rook to d8, so that's why I traded rooks first, so that I have this move available in case he tries going for this. So white cannot prevent my knight from coming to f5, and as a result, after the knight comes to f5, I'm eyeing this d4 square as well as this hanging pawn on g3. So I'm definitely doing very well here. Knight to f5, he goes knight to e4. Probably not the best idea for him. I'm not sure what else he does, but the computer doesn't really like it as much as simply going king to d3 and getting his king to a slightly safer square. But I continue with f6, a decent move here. I'm trying to chip away at this pawn structure as well as trying to liberate my bishop a little bit. This does create some weaknesses over here on the king side. I do create a pawn island, but I pretty much figured out that these pawns are really not moving, and it's really unlikely that white is going to play g4 and then g5 and creating a pass pawn. I think I have more than enough resources to counter that idea. So he goes b4, takes, and I go back to d6. Now I have other moves here, but I was, my opponent was sort of getting low on time. I wanted to play a little bit quicker and try to pressure him on the clock a little bit without making, very obvious blunders or mistakes. So I figured this was just a very natural idea. I want to trade off this knight so that g4 doesn't come with tempo, since that is white's idea to press, try to get a passed pawn. But after knight to d6 and we trade, I'm hitting this pawn and pieces are just coming off, and it's bishop against knight endgame is, if anything, it's better for black because pawns are on both flanks of the board here. So what I expected from this position was actually king to d3. I thought this was a little bit better because now at least you don't lose that time on the b4 pawn. I can still take and go here, but you can just defend it. So king to d3 is what I expected, but he took, which made it a lot easier. And after king to c3, I had this very powerful move, a5. And now I'm already starting to press a little bit because after a5, I get to install a bishop on b4 so that this pawn is always protected. His knight isn't really in a great spot right now. Meanwhile, my rook can invade potentially, as well as via g8 and attacking the pawn this way. But with best play, it should still be pretty balanced. We take, now giving me the outside passed pawn, but After his next few moves, knight to d4, I sort of missed the ball for one move with king to d7 because I thought that he was threatening to go rook to e1. I didn't really want to allow this, but apparently here I can just ignore this threat altogether because after rook to g8, I believe that after rook to e1, I had this move bishop to b4 check, so I can keep that in reserve. But here, yeah, there's just no immediate threat on e1 just yet, and or on e6, and as a result, tactically I'm doing fine. He can start with rook to a1, which he plays on the next move, I believe. Right here. Now I just go e5. He goes knight to f5. Now I just go bishop to b4 check. So I defend this guy, and his knight is a little bit annoying here because if I activate my rook and then let's say attack this knight in the future, he does have some sneaky threats that I have to be aware of, but if I don't fall into those, I should be more than fine. And so I trade a set of pawns. I figured this is logical because now the pawn structure is completely symmetrical, and except for on the queen side, but on the king side it's symmetrical, and I just failed to see what white is playing for here. He does maybe have a slightly more active king. He can get his king in maybe all the way over here, but I do have lots of scope and open files for my rook to use, so I figured this was fine. So I go rook to g8, and this is the final move of the game because I offered a draw here. Even though I could have maybe pressed a little, because I think practically this is definitely better for black, I just wasn't really feeling like pressing. I didn't want to overpress, and my opponent was a little bit lower on the clock, but not like super low. So I just felt it was the right decision to end the game right here if my opponent obliged. Now he can try king e4, but my plan, if he had tried to go in with his king, was to simply rook to g2, and I just don't really see anything here for white. He does not really have a way to target my pawns. And in the meantime, I'm the one with the threats. Let's say with rook to h2, I can keep giving checks. Over here, this pawn's weak, this pawn's weak. So, yeah. All in all, it was a decent game. Now, if I actually scroll down here for you guys, the bottom of the board here, showing the graph, the evaluation of the game. So it was pretty level for most of the game. Neither of us made any major mistakes or anything. Pretty accurate game overall. There were some micro inaccuracies here and there, mostly in the opening and then in the middle game, especially here when I missed my chance to get a pretty sizable advantage. But other than that, I thought I was in control for the entire game, and it was a good result. And yeah, that's about it for this YouTube video. Hope you guys enjoyed this recap, and we'll be back for future recaps some other time.